Good evening and welcome to this week's episode of Public Affairs, Public Access. I'm Staci Davis. Today we're talking about fascism and how to prevent it. We're also talking about immigration and the border. I am joined today with Dr. David Michael Smith, a political science doctorate, who is working with Never Again Action Houston and also with Houston United Front Against Fascism. David, welcome to the show. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Staci. Thanks for having me.
It's good to have you. So we were going to start off the conversation talking about there's an upcoming action. I think that it's pretty well known by now by most of the activist community that we're holding people at the border. We're holding men, women, and children down there. Apparently, these days, we've just found out that they're giving women hysterectomies against their will. So the situation is getting dire. It's getting a little bit crazy down there. And there's going to be an action soon. Why don't you start us by telling us a little bit about Never Again Action, how it got started, and what you guys are up to now?
Sure. In the summer of 2019, a number of Jewish people got together and talked about the fact that the concentration camps in which so many migrants are now being detained are eerily reminiscent of the early stages of the Shoah. And we don't have to end up there, but it's extremely frightening. And so before you know it, by July of last year, there was a network of Never Again Action groups around the country. And one of the things that was distinguishing about Never Again Action was a commitment to taking direct action in support of migrants against detentions and against the atrocities that you've been discussing already. And so here in Houston, we had a number of folks get together, Jewish and non-Jewish people from different kinds of backgrounds and different political tendencies get together. And we actually staged a couple of successful civil disobedience events last summer. In late July of last year, we basically had 7 of us block the driveway to the Southwest Key Detention Center at 419 Emancipation Avenue, which is the site of many protests over the last couple of years. Amazingly, although we were all prepared to be arrested, none of us were arrested for an hour and 40 minutes. The police commander on the scene apparently talked with somebody above his pay grade who said, "Don't arrest them this time," and so forth. And so we didn't have to go to jail, which is a lovely thing. But we were able to make a point about the fact that you shouldn't be detaining young people or any other migrants in these horrible facilities, whether they're ICE facilities or private detention centers. A few weeks later, on August 12th, 2019, we had a second action involving civil disobedience. Like the first action, we had more than 100 people gather for the demonstration as a whole, but we also, on August 12th last year, had 5 people that sat down in the middle of Emancipation Avenue, myself included, and basically shut down traffic for about half an hour. That's how long it took the police to warn us repeatedly and then arrest us and then haul us off on those short buses to the new Joint Processing Center, where the 5 of us spent almost 24 hours not really enjoying the extremely cold temperature, the lack of places to sleep, and the really bad food. But these were both successful actions. And, the second time, all of us were out within 24 hours, and we were glad that we did it. We ended up basically facing Class B misdemeanor charges, but we were able to work out a deal thanks to our attorney, who used to be active in one of the programs at Houston Media Source. And we all did 8 hours of community service apiece. I shelved books in the school library where my wife works. Other people worked at Houston Food Bank, so forth and so on. So we discharged our obligation like that. The charges were dismissed, and all was well. So that's
let me go back and ask you one question. First of all, for the Gentiles in the audience, what's a Shoah?
The Holocaust, the Jewish Holocaust in World War II. That's how many people have given it. And since there have been so many other kinds of different Holocausts, different mass deaths in history, sometimes it's good to identify, the Jewish Holocaust, what the fascists did to Jewish people.
Okay.
By that name.
And you said also that this was a successful demonstration. Successful in what way? What's going on with that key detention center now?
The struggle continues. I mean, we continue to have regular protests out there. Early on, when Southwest Key rented the building from a local investor, David Denenberg, and some of his co-owners, a lot of people, including the political establishment, opposed it and so forth. And the mayor of Houston initially said they wanted to try to stop, Southwest Key from turning it into a detention center and so forth. Southwest Key sued the city, and basically the city folded and stopped fighting it. And at that time, frankly, a number of other people stopped fighting it and so forth. But many other people, myself included, Never Again Action, Free Los Niños Coalition, other folks basically continued to protest. So, in 2 years, we've not been able to either prevent the opening of the center, and we have not yet succeeded in closing it down. But we continue to point out that it's a horrible thing to be detaining 16 and 17-year-old, basically children, there in the center. There are private charities who do a much better job of safeguarding and nurturing these young people till they can be reunited with their families. And Southwest Key has made a fortune doing this. I mean, there's so much scandal associated with Southwest Key that their chief executive officer and the chief financial officer both had to resign last year. Southwest Key personnel have been indicted and in some cases convicted of sexual abuse, felony sexual abuse charges in Arizona. And they violated tons of regulations in Arizona, Texas, and California. I mean, it's just a really bad company, and they should not be in the business of detaining kids. So Never Again Action and other folks, we're going to continue to sort of publicize what's going on and continue to fight to free the migrants there. And frankly, our broader goal nationally in Never Again Action is to close down ICE and close down all the detention centers to free everybody.
Now, ICE was started. ICE is a relatively new. I mean, ICE was started. What, it was in the Bush administration, correct?
Yeah, with the Department of Homeland Security, which is had to put it mildly, a very mixed record. Maybe not safeguarding the homeland so much as they are repressing people.
And before them, what did we do with immigrants when they tried to come to this country, and how's it changed now?
It's much more militarized now. There's much more detentions and so forth. I mean, for the longest time since immigration reform in the 1980s, you didn't have like mass detentions. Some detentions and so forth, but it's one thing if you're chasing known terrorists or murderers and so forth, but that's not what we're talking about here. So, I mean, as much as I criticize George W. Bush, and there's a lot to criticize, like the invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq, he didn't have the same venal, racist hatred of migrants as like Trump does, for example. But having said that, all of us have to recognize that the tendency toward mass deportations cranked up not under Trump, but under President Obama.
That's correct.
And that's why many people, in advocacy organizations, myself included, have to refer to Mr. Obama as the deporter in chief. He certainly makes, Trump look awful. At least President Obama was, intelligent, educated, could put sentences together, had good syntax and diction and so forth. But, between 2.5 million and 3 million people were deported, the overwhelming majority of whom were not criminals, not felons, not anybody who did anything really seriously wrong. And that was a really bad precedent that Trump picked up on, and in some ways has made worse.
Well, I would say so. I mean, we were going to talk a little bit about fascism, how this is a part of fascism, and definitely that definitely seems like Trump has taken it on with full force, and is just running with it, and it links right into fascism. Wouldn't you think?
Well, absolutely. I mean, different views exist on the nature of fascism, how to define it, and so forth. And people from 2015 on to the present day have been talking about whether Trump's a fascist, what that means exactly, so forth and so on. And I would say that as time has gone on, there are more and more reasons to be very gravely concerned about the fact that he's not only a virulent racist, but very authoritarian and no respect for so-called constitutional norms. Having said all of that, most folks on the left, by which I mean, Marxist, communist, socialist organizations, would say that we don't have a fascist society now in the sense that the government doesn't rule, through open violence and terrorist dictatorship yet. On the other hand, when Trump starts talking about stealing the election, Like when Trump has been willing to imprison or detain large numbers of migrants, when he's been able to separate families on a much bigger scale than ever before, when you have these, hysterectomies and other medical procedures publicized in, rural Georgia, some of these things just are extremely, extremely frightening. And it's important to keep a level head and to have an analysis about, different kinds of authoritarianism short of fascism. But we're definitely on a very frightening road. And that's something that I think increasingly not only leftist organizations recognize, but also liberal and progressive academics. And we're not going in the right direction. And the question arises, who's going to stop this? Who's going to stop Trump from stealing the election? Who's going to prevent the emergence of a really authoritarian substitute for what we've had in the past, which is bourgeois democracy, but better than a dictatorship? And who's going to stop that? Who's going to prevent the rise of fascism? I think the short answer is it's going to have to be us. It's going to have to be we, the people, working class people, racially and nationally oppressed people, women, LGBTQ communities, democratic minded people in general, migrants, folks of all different political backgrounds who agree we can never again have fascism. We can never again have that kind of right wing dictatorship.
And not to mention also, just to throw this in there, but also they were uh, taking protesters off the streets, putting them in vans, unmarked vans, unmarked police officers, and disappearing them for a couple of days. I think most of them returned, but that was also going on as well.
Yeah, that was pretty scary. And then when you basically see Trump for the last 4 years openly telling police they don't have to safeguard suspected criminals too much when they take them into custody. Don't worry about their head banging against the inside of a vehicle. I mean, that's not a dog whistle. That's like a siren call. And when Trump basically won't criticize racism and brutality and murder by cops, but he wants to complain about property damage by protesters, well, to borrow a phrase, there's your sign. So there are all sorts of warning signs about Trump that are really frightening. But I'm from the point of view, the perspective that emphasizes that Trump is a symptom of a disease. I mean, it's not just Trump and his, horrific family members and so forth, and the toadies and sycophants that he's in office with. It's also these, frenzied middle class people, almost always, not always, but almost always white, who they feared Obama as a black president. They fear the country changing demographically. They fear more diversity in the society. And they fear that our view of what government should do for the people is going to change too. And so instead of engaging in dialogue and debate about these matters with everybody else in the society, they'd rather support a virulent racist who has no regard for constitutional norms. And that is pretty frightening. I mean, it is.
I agree with you. So tell me a little. Let's talk a little bit about the action that will be going on. I believe it's October 2nd. Is that right?
Yes, indeed. Never Again Action Houston has scheduled another protest at the Core Civic ICE Detention Center. It's called the Houston Processing Center, though that doesn't quite capture the horror. And that's located at 15850 Export Plaza Drive. Again, that's 15850 Export Plaza Drive in North Houston. And we're going to be there starting at 5:30. We were there a few months ago in June for a car protest. We had 40 cars, 60 people, and a lot of young people. It's really wonderful. This will be an in-person protest. This will be our first in-person protest at the facility in a while. But we'll be there to basically demand the closure of ICE and private detention centers and the freeing of migrants. And it's really, really timely. So we're asking everybody who's interested to come out and join in that event on October 2nd.
Tell me, how many detention centers are there in Houston, and who's being held in these detention centers?
There are several in Houston, and it's hard to give a definite, maybe five, but one, another Southwest Key Detention Center was closed down a few months ago, and so forth. But the one in North Houston, the Core Civic place, basically does adults. It holds adults, and actually, people have been dying there, every so often for years and years and years. In contrast, the Southwest Key facility at 419 Emancipation Avenue is owned, basically basically by a private entity, a private company, Southwest Key, and they're holding just 16 and 17-year-olds there. But there are a couple of other facilities in Houston too, I understand.
So the main two that you're talking about are Core Civic and Southwest Key. Uh, who's taking care of these people? Who are the guards? Like, let's talk a little bit about how these people are trained, and if they're trained to take care of people in this way.
Well, to judge from reports from people who have been detained and then later released and able to speak about it, the short answer is not real well. I mean, not real well at all. I mean, Southwest Key basically, has, a fair number of Spanish speaking staff, and they basically have for a long, long time said, we're really caring and so forth. We really try to take care of those in our charge. And they insist that they're not a detention center. But that's only true in the strict legal sense that people are not committed there because they've committed a crime. They do have security personnel who try to prevent people from leaving and so forth. And again, if you look at the record, read the New York Times or like Arizona press in particular, over the last few years, there have been, well, I know of at least 3 felony sexual abuse cases out in Arizona alone.
Wow.
There have been other widespread charges of medical neglect, other neglect, physical abuse, staff pushing and shoving young people. Well, look, we all know that young people, you remember being young, you can be boisterous, and especially if you're in an environment like that, you're not going to be a happy camper. But there's no excuse for staff pushing and shoving, physically abusing people, young people. There's no excuse for medical neglect. And especially now with COVID, it takes on a whole new dimension of danger and so forth. So even though Southwest Key generally looks for people who have some kind of experience in the field, some kind of degree, and often, Spanish language abilities, it doesn't change the fact. I mean, 2 summers ago, you had media in Houston writing about hundreds and hundreds of violations of state administrative rules by Southwest Key in Texas alone, never mind Arizona and California. And the story is frankly even worse when you talk about ICE facility. I mean, Core Civic has a long, long history of making a lot of money for their investors by running ICE facilities. And, sometimes there have been deaths from medical neglect. Sometimes there have been deaths more recently from COVID. Sometimes there have been suicides, and you would expect your staff to be watching for people who are known to be depressed, known to be anxious, and frankly, who would not be depressed or anxious when you're incarcerated like that, simply because you came to this country trying to make a living and take care of your family. But, over the years, whether in ICE facilities proper or private detention centers, there have been quite a number of deaths. One statistic that I saw, a few months ago indicated that since 2003, you're talking about perhaps 200 deaths in detention centers around the country. And frankly, that's not an entirely reliable number. My sense is that's probably an understatement of the real problem. And on top of the deaths, it's sort of hard to quantify the misery and the suffering that people go through. And, to be honest, there's so much work to be done. There's so many contributions to be made to our society. Migrants have always contributed to our society. And if you're not a descendant of a slave brought here in chains, or if you're not an indigenous person, basically the rest of us migrated, or our ancestors migrated to this country. I mean, my ancestors, just to give a personal example, most of them came from Ireland in the 1840s and 1850s, not because they wanted to be white supremacist settlers, although that's how this country got started, because they were starving, because the potatoes went bad, and the British basically took the potatoes that didn't go bad and let the Irish starve. And I mean, to be honest, all of us, all at a human level, ought to sort of recognize that you can't really ban migrants on land that's been stolen or conquered. That's really just horrifically unjust. And there's some measure in justice in saying, as some of our friends say, that we really need an America para todos, United States for everybody. And so, because we're not really talking about having to deal with a lot of dangerous, murderous felons or terrorists, you talk about the 11 million migrants here without papers now. They really need to not be detained, not be deported, not be harmed they need to be released, and the folks who aren't being detained need a path to legalization and citizenship. And that's something that actually a surprisingly large number of people in our country agree with and have for 15 years. On the other hand, a small minority, relatively small minority in the US Senate has blocked that really since 2005 and will continue to do so as long as they're in power.
What do you think that is? Do you think that's a play to the Republican base? What do you think it's
Increasingly,
about?
yes. I think it has a lot to do with racism. I mean, the problem existed before Obama ever came any place near the White House. And again, George Bush, I don't trust much of what he said about compassionate conservatism, but just because he was more of a country club Republican and from Texas, he sort of recognized that, you really need to treat migrants right and you don't need to be busting them all the time and so forth. But a lot of people, Republicans further to the right than Bush, didn't want that to happen. And part of that was even 15 years ago, they feared the increasing diversification of our society, what author Steve Phillips has called the browning of America. And why they should fear that tells you more about them than it does about the migrants and so forth. So I think racism has a lot to do with it. And then when Obama was elected, and it wasn't all that close and so forth, the Republicans had a choice. They could sort of like rethink their politics, update their politics, and try to appeal to conservatives from different communities with an updated version of Republican doctrine, or they could move further to the right, and they chose the latter option. They basically spawned the Tea Party, pretending it was grassroots when it actually was like AstroTurf, funded by the same right-wing forces have been to the right of Bush. And we know the rest of it. Started the birther BS about Obama not being born in the United States, really racist, vile stuff. And, by the time Obama was halfway through his 2 terms, a solid number of Republicans were saying they thought he was from Kenya, they thought he was Muslim. And, that's like people drinking the wrong Kool-Aid for sure. So racism has a lot to do with it. And it's part of what explains how Trump came to power as well.
Let's go meta a little bit. You were talking before about what capitalism has to do with fascism, and I'd like for you to expound on that for a little bit.
Sure. Sometimes people, very well intended and decent and smart people too, use fascism to refer to, some kind of authoritarian rule, involves somebody with a lot of powers, if not necessarily a dictator, glorification of the media, of the military, downgrading of other institutions, so forth and so on. And something I've had to point out to colleagues and friends from time to time, not just in universities, but out in the street, as it were, is that if you take a list of some of the major features that sometimes people associate with fascism, you take a list and you look at what's going on in our country, some of those features, such as glorification of the media and disdain for human rights, at least for some groups, some of those things have characterized us throughout most of our history. When we take rose colored glasses off, we have to recognize that our society has always been viciously racist. It's always been misogynistic. It's always been really ugly toward the other, as it were, who gets scapegoated every time you have an economic downturn, every time you have a crisis, a long term secular crisis in the economy, and so forth, or in our case, profound demographic change. So for me, I'm one of those folks, like most Marxists, most communists, most socialists, that don't describe Trump as a fascist, although we have some very, very real concerns about him being viciously racist, authoritarian, and the fact that some of his supporters are neo-Nazis, but he thinks that some of them are very fine people. It lets you know that there is a very grave danger here. I mean, for most of his life, despite being viciously racist and misogynistic and a sexual predator and a sociopath and a pathological liar, for most of his life, Trump has been a liberal Democrat.
Right.
Go figure, right? But I think the fact that he could never gain acceptance in sort of like the old blue blood money in New York, and he could never really win the respect of a lot of major capitals there or anyplace else, combined with seeing Obama basically, as it were, work his way up, become president, and become the most admired politician around. It's not an endorsement of Obama, but I think they just really rubbed Trump personally the wrong way. So I've often told my friends, if Trump weren't so selfish and self-centered and were more ideological, he probably would have been fascist a long time ago and so forth. But for him, it's mainly me, 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 me making money, people adoring me like his parents never could, apparently, and so forth, making money for his corporation and his family. On the other hand, he sort of was smart enough to figure out that no decent human being is going to support him. And so what Trump basically has done is appeal not just to country club Republicans that like his support for capitalism, capital accumulation, but he's also appealed to the racist white voters that have been part of the Republican coalition since Nixon's Southern strategy in 1968. And, to be honest, he's been relatively successful at that. If we had a democratic process for electing presidents in this country, he would not be president. He lost by 2.9 million popular votes, and that was to the second most unpopular presidential candidate in U.S. history, right? But because of very narrow margins in 3 states, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan, less than 80,000 total votes, he became the president. And it's a compelling argument to have direct democratic election of the president if you're going to have a president. But it's also sort of a wake-up sign because he didn't get into office and start changing for the better. He got into office and just jacked up the racism, jacked up the attack on working class people, jacked up his support for helping the rich get richer, and to hell with all the rest of us.
Let's talk a little bit about. I kind of want to talk about the intersection of the spike in racism versus the downturn in the economy. It seems to me like there's always been a connection there. And since you're a professor in political science, maybe you can expound on that a little bit or clarify some things for me.
I'll do my best. For the longest time, the United States economy, it suffered from, recessions or occasionally very great recessions that we call depressions all throughout our history. I mean, the first set of economic down cycles, the first time you had a recession was like in the 1820s. And we've had recessions every 6 to 10 years like clockwork ever since. In the 1870s, 1890s, you had 2 really depressions is what they were. You had a third one that we call the Great Depression. I call it the Third Great Depression, starting in 1929. That was cured only by production for war for World War II.
That was the Third Great Depression?
It was, absolutely.
There were 2 more before then?
The 1870s and in the 1890s.
Huh.
Sometimes people will say, oh, they were just really god-awful recessions. It's like, okay. I consider them, like a lot of people consider them, depressions. But the fact of the matter is that because of the nature of capitalism and the problem of relative overproduction, because workers' wages are limited to only a fraction of the wealth or value they produce, as a whole, workers can never produce all the products that we can never purchase all the products that we produce. And so basically what capitalists do is sell surplus products in other countries, to basically get rid of them, realize their profits by selling them. But people in other parts of the world, there's only so much that they can buy too because they have limited wages as well. And when it becomes more profitable for the capitalists to have workers produce less, when it's more profitable to cut production, to basically stop producing food, clothing, shelter, and so forth, to start laying off people, that's what happens. And when you have a decline in production, that's really what we call a recession. And if it's really horrific decline in production, that's what we call a depression. And to be honest, despite the recessions and depressions we've had in US history, up through the 1970s, the US economy was still sort of rolling along, as it were, the envy of the capitalist world, if not of the rest of the world, which has most of the people and so forth. But starting in the 1970s, you had both Japan and Germany, then later the European countries, sort of like rebuilt from World War II, starting to become more competitive and so forth. At the same time, you eventually had automation and what we today call globalization, deindustrialization, the export of jobs to other countries. And what this meant was that by the year 2000, the US economy was not chugging along the same way. And basically, we've had a number of problems economically since then, not just the recession early in the new millennium, but then the one several years later in 2008. Some of that's because of globalization and the fact that US companies are basically engaged in a race to the bottom to find the cheapest labor on the planet, whether it's in China or Vietnam or someplace else. and they make more money by paying lower labor costs, which explains why you have a lot more unemployment in our country than you used to. Not that the government reports all of that adequately and so forth. You've also had some pretty serious social problems that have arisen. Where do you think the opiate crisis came from? I mean, I saw one estimate that 700,000 people have died really since about 1990. And a lot of that was not opiate trafficking in back alleys. A lot of that was prescribed by your friendly doctors and so forth. And it was real profitable to do that and so forth. So basically, what's happened is that large numbers of workers in our country that formerly could at least hope to get a job, hold a job for 35 years, retire with a pension, and be able to support themselves, find that's no longer the case. And, quite a while back, people figured out that maybe it would take both a husband and a wife or two people in a household working to make things viable economically to survive and so forth. But even like that, it's been harder and harder for people to find decent paying jobs with wages that you can live on. And people have lost a lot of faith in what used to be called the American dream. Malcolm rightly called it the American nightmare, but especially for a lot of better paid white workers and white middle strata people, there was this notion that if I work hard and play by the rules, to borrow a phrase from Clinton, everything will be okay. And folks have really discovered in the last couple of decades, everything's not okay. You don't have the promise of the American dream. People are struggling just to survive. Large numbers of people aren't really surviving very well and have left the labor force. And you got a problem with opiates. At the same time, you have more and more people, including a bunch of white Americans, saying we need to fight against racism, we need to fight for equality, economic and racial equality. And instead of developing an analysis about the problems of capitalism, some folks on the right and the far right, frankly, including Trump and his supporters, have said it's their fault. It's them. It's the other. It's migrants. It's Muslims. It's black people. It's people from S-hole countries and so forth. And that kind of racial scapegoating and targeting, it's always been part of U.S. history. It's always been horrific. And now, at the same time that more and more Americans, a historically unprecedented number of people in our country, including white people, are saying, yeah, basta, no more racism, let's move ahead together. At the same time, you have this opposing force saying, we liked things better in the 1950s. And some of them liked things better in the 1850s. That's how scary it is.
So how do you fight a monster like fascism? And I guess that kind of brings up that how does the Houston United front against fascism, the other organization that you're with, and you're welcome to talk about any other organizations that you may be with, but what's the plan?
If I had a great plan, frankly, it's a capitalist society. I'd probably have to market that so I'd have a nicer retirement and so forth. No, just kidding. The truth of the matter is we fight fascism by helping people understand the dangerous direction in which Trump is heading, and also the fact that there are people even more dangerous than Trump. I mean, to be honest, the neo-Nazis whom he praised, at least some of them as very fine people at Charlottesville, some of these folks are pretty clear about what they would like to see. You also have, armed right-wing militia.
Let's stop you there. What in what way are they clear about what they want to see? What do they want to see? And
let me give
on that a little bit. Yeah.
Let me give an example. A couple of years ago, there was a neo-Nazi who was interviewed briefly on Houston television, who basically said that while he supported Trump as long as Trump was promoting racism, this man actually said on air he would like to see Jared Kushner gassed because he's Jewish. I couldn't believe the editors ran with that. It's like, my wife, Rona, is Jewish. We both identify as Jewish in the face of fascism, as well as identify as communists and so forth. I couldn't believe the sentiment, but that's what you got out there. And to be honest, the open neo-Nazis that talk like that in public, they're smaller in number, but you have other fascists like Three Percenters, Oath Keepers, Patriot Front, and so forth, who are pretty much in the same category. They'll deny that they're fascists, but that's exactly what they are. And not to pile on the bad news, but then there are people who own a fair amount of wealth, capitalists and investors, that finance these groups and so forth, or who finance Trump for that matter. And so what we see is a very dangerous combination of a virulent, racist, and authoritarian president with no regard for constitutional or democratic norms may not be a typical fascist, may not be a fascist proper per se, but he's supported by, as it were, fascist and other far right militia groups. He's supported by, frankly, capitalists and other folks with money who basically think that he should take the gloves off when it comes to dealing with people like my wife and myself and so forth. And then trying to steal the election is a really dangerous thing. Putting people in jail, incarcerating them because they're migrants, separating families, allowing forced medical procedures that people don't know about, like the hysterectomies in rural Georgia. Some of these other kinds of things are barbaric. For that matter, Trump lying pathologically every time he opens his mouth virtually, that's really horrific. But trying to steal the election takes us to a whole new level of danger. And if you ask, how do you fight that? A short answer is the only way you can defeat fascism is with the power of the people as a whole. The people as a whole are divided. The good news for us as anti-fascists is that these virulent racists, these fascists, these people who support Trump only represent a minority of the population. They don't represent half the country. They don't represent 40% of the country. It might be like 30% if I had to guess. On the other hand, they're extremely dangerous. And frankly, the rest of us need to get off our butts and sort of recognize not only the danger, but the fact that you can't count on Democratic Party politicians, you can't count on lawyers, you can't count on the courts to solve this problem for us. I mean, frankly, all of these avenues and all of these other folks that I mentioned, if they can help stop Trump, that's all good and fine. But it's really going to take the masses of people saying, never again, literally, never again. We're not going to let this happen again. And one of the people that works in Houston United Front Against Fascism is a man from Germany who understands very clearly what happened in his country. And he sort of recognizes that the key is to crush them in the beginning, to stop them before they become a full-fledged dictatorship and before they start coming for people like my friend and myself and my wife and people like you for doing interviews like this.
Like Timothy Snyder said, don't give away any power at the beginning. Uh, I forgot my question. I was going to talk about QAnon and how the QAnon philosophy mirrors some of the early Nazi philosophy. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, it's really, really bizarre. The QAnon organization, and it is an organization, so it got started online, but it's actually moved into the streets. These are folks, it's a cult, it's a pro-Trump cult. It's a really crazy pro-Trump cult, but they're a little different than your traditional Trumpsters or your fascists, whether they're neo-Nazis or fascists who deny they're fascists. These folks basically spin a set of conspiracy theories that suggest that Democrats and wealthy billionaires, many of whom are Jewish, they say, and other folks like Hollywood celebrities are basically engaged in a worldwide conspiracy to promote pedophilia and to promote human trafficking. And they actually have this part of their view that says that the so-called cabal is basically engaged in human trafficking so they can extract a chemical substance from the blood of abused children in order to prolong their own lives. At one level, our response ought to be, they need to put the pipe down. That's just crazy stuff. On the other hand, we know from Nazi eugenics, from all sorts of anti-Semitism and Nazi propaganda, they were always willing to blame certain elites while cozying up to more right-wing elites in Germany. They've always been anti-Semitic, and you see that again here. But the notion, I got a lot of criticism of the Democrats, don't get me wrong, but the idea that Democrat politicians are running the world, it's like that's about as crazy as the rest of the theory. But what's happening right now around the country is that QAnon groups and people influenced by QAnon, even if they're not totally there yet as part of the cult, are organizing rallies against human trafficking. Look, human trafficking is horrific and needs to be opposed, but advocacy organizations that really genuinely, legitimately are fighting trafficking are finding that it's really problematic to have the QAnon people sort of getting involved in this. because the QAnon people don't just spread this crazy stuff about trafficking being a big problem. That part's right, but they do the rest of the story there about who's responsible. The Democrats, rich Jewish billionaires like George Soros and so forth, Hollywood celebrities, many of whom are Jewish. It's like sirens, not dog whistles, and so forth. But they go on to basically say there's only one man on the planet that can put an end to this horror, and that's Donald Trump.
Yeah,
And
that seems to be the problem, is their only solution. While there's people out there fighting against human trafficking, we've got laws against it. We've got, judges, nurses. We're teaching people that run hotels how to recognize human trafficking. They don't do any of that stuff. They've got one solution and one solution only, and that's vote for Trump. Trump will fix it all.
Absolutely. And so it's not entirely surprising that QAnon folks, not all the time, but most of the time, look like the rest of the Trump supporters. They're predominantly white. They're not mainly working class people, though you have some backward workers too, but often they're middle strata and sometimes fairly successful people that you would not expect to buy into a cult and drink the Kool-Aid, but they do. They do. So they're extremely
Oh yeah.
dangerous and they need to be combated. Wherever they appear, there really needs to be regular folks coming out and saying trafficking is awful, but so is QAnon and so is Trump. Trafficking needs to be stopped, QAnon needs to be stopped, and Trump needs to be stopped too.
And I think that also, save the children is almost always the way. I mean, Save the Children was what Jim Jones was saying as he was poisoning all these people. He was that we were doing They were doing it for the children. And in Nazi Germany, a lot of the rumors that were going around had to do with Jews sacrificing babies as well.
The old blood libel, absolutely.
Right.
I hate to say it, but it's like 2,000 years of this anti Semitic stuff. And it pops up, not just in the QAnon stuff, but also in the views of some of the open fascists that support Trump. And, Trump apparently is okay about his daughter being married to a man of Jewish tradition and so forth. But that's because they share a certain kind of class interest and certain kind of really reactionary politics. But it's well known that Trump's been, trafficking in anti-Semitic tropes forever. About who he wants to count his money and so forth and so on. It's just like it's really vile stuff, and it needs to be combated. Like the anti-Muslim, the anti-Mexican, the anti-migrant, the anti-African, the anti-black stuff. It's like, it's really vile stuff. But that's Trump and his supporters. Really vile.
Absolutely. So, you've got do you let me ask you to kind of like a little hard question, and as far as Democrats are concerned and the financial divide, do you have any comments on how the financial divide isn't just the fault of Republicans, but it's the fault of this whole capitalistic way of life that we have? Do you have any comment on that?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, unless one is like even older than I am, in which case one would remember this. But otherwise, unless you read it in the history books, you wouldn't know that in the 1930s and the 1940s, there were mass movements of socialists and communists in this country. I'm not talking about folks toting guns, looking to harm even rich people, but people demonstrate. That's how we got Social Security. That's how we got union rights. That's how we got, some of the best parts of the so-called welfare state in this country. But, frankly, after World War II, when the Truman administration decided to start a Cold War against the Soviets, lest they spread, including in the United States, their ideology. Ever since then, both the Democrats and the Republicans have sort of almost uncritically supported capitalism. The Democrats usually want some kind of regulation that's, I'd say, wholly inadequate and so forth, but they've both been really, rabidly committed to the preservation of capitalism. And the Democrats' commitment to even a liberal veneer over that has sort of varied from time to time. Bill Clinton was like a Republican light in certain respects and so forth. But
Yeah,
anyway,
there was some he was going to get rid of Social Security until the Monica Lewinsky thing came out.
yeah, and you remember that Clinton actually famously or infamously said that the era of big government is over.
That's
It's
right.
like, why would you concede that? It's like you want good, smart government, but you want government to serve the people. I would tell you that neither Republicans nor Democrats have ever wanted that. And I don't discount the possibility that some politicians believe their own speechwriters. On the other hand, the reality is that although this is the wealthiest country in the history of the world, we have twice the amount of poverty that the government admits, regardless of who's president. We have twice the amount of economic insecurity. Most people have never been doing great in our country. That's just the ugly truth of the matter. We've never really gotten a handle on capitalist exploitation or racism or misogyny or all the other kinds of bigotry. And the US has been at war virtually every year of its existence. I mean, it's not just the original sins of genocide against Native people and slavery and segregation. It's war after war after war. And, one thing that a lot of people don't know about is how many millions of people have died in workplace accidents and because of workplace diseases in order to make the capitalists even richer. So this problem of capitalism, I believed all my adult life, is insoluble. I don't think you can solve it under capitalism. I think you need a different kind of society. I think it needs to be radically democratic. I don't think you need a dictatorship of like a few people or anything, but I think that ending capitalism is important. But even for folks who don't necessarily agree with that, we need people who are, on the left like me, but also folks that maybe haven't given up on capitalism, but still believe in this notion of democracy. All of us need to come together and oppose fascism wherever we can. And that's really what the Houston United Front Against Fascism has been doing. We're only a couple of years old, but if you got a couple of minutes, I can tell you about some of the stuff we've been doing
I'd
because
love to hear. Yeah.
um, I don't know if you remember hearing, but on the Labor Day weekend in 2018 at the George R. Brown Convention Center, there was a really large national convention sponsored by the Islamic Society of North America. Really beautiful conference with thousands and thousands of people coming to learn about not just religion, but current events, getting involved in politics, how to live with everybody in the society and so forth. And it was really successful. Unfortunately, though, you had about 3 dozen armed fascists and other right-wing folks that showed up to protest against the Muslims. Why? Because they're Muslims. It was really horrible. On the other hand, we had advance notice and we turned out about 3 times that number of people to oppose them. And frankly, some of us were carrying weapons too. Sometimes I'm grateful for being a veteran of the U.S. Army. I did learn a few things while I was in the infantry. And the fascists were supposed to have a 3-day protest. They barely made it through the first day. They couldn't come back on the second day. Third day, they didn't even try. And so we were all very happy about that, happy about our turnout, the diversity of the turnout. We had African American activists, Hispanic activists, some of the Muslim people from the convention came over and danced with us and so forth. It was a really good show of the best of Houston saying, we're not ever going to see this stuff again. So fast forward to Labor Day last year in 2019, uh, only half the fascists came out, and one of the sponsoring organizations didn't even show up at all. And we came prepared. Some of us with long guns and so forth, and none of their sides showed up with long guns. They had a few people with pistols and so forth, and they didn't stay very long. So we're really happy about that.
That was easy.
Yeah, I mean, it takes a lot of work to sort of plan for these things. And, we had to rent a sound system and get a generator so we could drown out their nasty hate talk and so forth. But everything turned out fine. Um, and this last year, the Islamic Society held its convention in Chicago. And so we didn't have to deal with fascists trying to, protest or threaten them or anything. But we're really glad that we did those 2 actions. And we've actually gone out on other occasions. For example, there was a Finnish band called Horna that translates in English, the word would be abyss, like hell. And a couple of the members are stone cold Nazis. And so when we found out they were coming last year, we basically started putting out the word. And the initial venue, the original place that was going to host them, disinvited them and said, nah, you can't come, too much controversy and so forth. They found another locale that would host them, and we couldn't stop that. And so when they performed that night, we had about a dozen of us show up, and half of us with weapons. And we basically were telling the neighbors what a bad thing it was to have Nazis, white supremacists in the neighborhood, in the venue. It's like everyone loves music, but not Nazi music. It's like, no. And so actually, one of the bizarre things that happened that night, which turned out safe and sound for everybody, but one of the bizarre things that happened that night is that even at a distance, we recognized this guy named Cameron, James Cameron, who's a member of Atomwaffen, one of the most violent neo-Nazi groups. And he and one of his buddies were there, and they were giving Nazi salutes, Heil Hitler salutes from inside the club. And, we're all very disciplined, so that, we didn't do anything and so forth. But it's like, that was just very, very revealing about the kind of people that were coming. Of course, some months ago.
Can you call out the club, or how do you feel about it?
I want to remember the name of it correctly. So if it comes to me in a second, I think the first place that disinvited the name I remember. The second name I'm not sure I remember right offhand, and I apologize for that. Ironically, and this is a U.S. kind of story, the owners are Hispanic.
Yeah, I think I know the club you're talking about. I think they're pretty over there on Canal Street.
Near there, yeah.
I know the place you're talking about. Been there many times.
It was just strange. Anyway, this guy Denton, or Cameron Denton, whatever his name is, basically just some months ago
James Cameron.
Yeah, was basically arrested because of his involvement in this neo-Nazi organization and preparation for violence and so forth. Like at least 5 murders have been associated with the Atomwaffen and so forth. And so we were glad when he was taken into custody. A couple of other fascists who have turned out in other events, other demonstrations that QFAF activists were protesting before QFAF ever came into existence. A couple of people associated with the White Lives Matter group that Ken Reed was running. 2 of them are in prison in Florida for basically shooting at protesters in Gainesville a few years ago. One of their other people is basically, last time I heard, was going through a legal process here for violence against his girlfriend here in Houston. So some of these people are where they deserve to be, in prison, safely behind bars, but frankly, others need to be. And so, Houston United Front Against Fascism is going to continue to fight against these people. We're going to continue to expose them and educate people about them. And right now we're working with other folks, other organizations, Houston Socialist Movement, to which I also belong, the new organization called Save TPS, Save Temporary Protected Status, which is a pro-migrant organization, a local organization called Trabajadores del Hogar Sin Fronteras, Domestic Workers Without Borders, and a bunch of other individuals. And all of us are working together in this new coalition against Trump and fascism. And we're supporting the Never Again action on October 2nd, because we all support that strongly. But we'll be organizing other actions to basically protest against Trump stealing the election, because we're frankly counting on him doing that. And we're organizing now to do our part to try to prevent that.
So people, if they wanted to get involved, would they look for your Facebook pages, or how would they? To be frank, what would be the best way to get involved? Sometimes you email these organizations and they don't get back to you very quickly. So what would you advise for people getting involved?
Folks have options. For viewers that would like to get involved or would like more information, at least, folks are welcome to visit the Houston United Front Against Facebook page. You can send us a message or send us an email, but you're also welcome to call. And let me give you a number here. It's 832-692-2306. Let me repeat that. It's 832-692-2306. One of the advantages of being retired from teaching is that I'm available on the phone a lot of the time. And when I'm not writing, I'm working on a book, but when I'm not writing and when I'm not organizing politically, I'm available to talk to people. And I'd love to hear from folks.
That sounds good. I'll be podcasting this as well. So I'll put it in the description of my podcast. The podcast is called The Texas Radical. Tell us a little bit about the book that you're writing. I'd like to hear about that.
The book is titled Endless Holocausts, and the subtitle is Mass Deaths in the History of the United States Empire. Chapter 1 is about the genocide inflicted on indigenous people in our country. It was worse in other parts of the hemisphere, but it was pretty bad here. The second chapter is about what happened to African Americans. Sometimes people think slavery was the worst part. Actually, slavery was just the beginning. And not just the violence that's been done to people, but just uncounted millions of people have died. People of African descent have died because of the psychological and physiological stressors of racism and inadequate health care and so forth. The third chapter is called The Workers' Holocaust, and I try to calculate the number of workers who have died since the Industrial Revolution really got underway in the US after 1860, who have died because of workplace accidents, fatal occupational injuries,
Hmm.
or workplace diseases. And then we have three chapters, it takes three chapters to talk about all the wars the US has either been directly responsible for or has helped out with. And the final chapter talks about other kinds of deaths, from police violence, homicides, suicides, drug related deaths. And that did not start with the opiate crisis, and deaths in detention and incarceration. So it's a grim and macabre book, but somebody needs to count the bodies and talk about it. So that's what I'm trying to do.
Well, we're going to have to leave it kind of right there. We've got just a couple of more seconds. Tell them one more time. The name of the book is.
Endless holocausts.
When
The
do you think
stuff.
that's going to come out?
Well, I've got the first three chapters in a book proposal at a publisher now, and I'm waiting anxiously to hear whether they're going to bite, and we'll see.
Good
But
luck.
if they don't bite, I've got a list of other publishers. It will get published.
Okay, and then the Never Again Action Houston. You can go on the Facebook page for that. Uh,
Absolutely. Never Again Action Houston, and that event is October 2nd, Friday, October 2nd, 5:30 p.m. at 15850 Export Plaza Drive.
the telephone number again, if you want to get in touch with Dr. Smith, is 832-692-2306. That's all we have time for. David, thank you very much for coming on the show. We appreciate having you.
Thanks so much, Staci. Hope to see you again.
I hope to see you. I'm sure I will.